Barack Obama adjusted his tie as he stepped into the bustling community center, a place where his presence was unexpected yet deeply appreciated. The air buzzed with chatter, laughter, and the clinking of cups as local residents gathered for their weekly meeting. Barack had always been drawn to spaces like this, ordinary places where extraordinary connections were born. Today, he wasn't here as a former president or a world leader. No cameras, no entourage. Just a man wanting to reconnect with the people who had always inspired him. A few heads turned as he walked in, some faces lighting up with recognition while others seemed indifferent. One woman nudged her friend, whispering in disbelief. But before the murmurs could ripple through the crowd, Barack took a seat at the back of the room, blending in as best he could. "I'm here to listen," he said softly to a nearby volunteer who had greeted him with wide eyes. It was a humble move, but not everyone saw it that way. In the corner, a young man named Jason leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his lips curled into a subtle smirk. Jason was known in the neighborhood for his sharp tongue and knack for turning any situation into a performance. As Barack sat quietly, Jason couldn't resist the urge to speak up. "So, what brings a man like you down to our little center?" he asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. His tone wasn't welcoming. It was laced with sarcasm. A few chuckles followed, and some heads turned toward Barack, waiting to see how he would respond. Barack looked up, his expression calm but thoughtful. "I've always believed the best ideas come from places like this," he said, his voice steady yet warm. "From people who understand their communities better than anyone else." His answer was sincere, but Jason wasn't about to back down. "Well, I hope you're ready for some real talk," Jason shot back, his smirk growing wider. The room grew tense, the light-hearted atmosphere replaced by a palpable unease. A few people shifted in their seats, unsure of what would happen next. Barack simply nodded, as if inviting whatever came his way. Jason stepped forward, his voice rising with each word. "You know, it's easy to show up now, after everything's done and dusted. But where were you when people here were struggling, when they needed someone to really care?" His words echoed in the room, leaving a charged silence in their wake. Barack leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. He didn't interrupt, didn't react defensively. Instead, he let Jason's words hang in the air, giving them the weight they deserved. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. And then, just as Jason seemed ready to continue, Barack raised his hand gently, signaling he had something to say. What Barack said next would change the entire tone of the room, and leave everyone questioning their assumptions about him and each other. But that moment hadn't arrived yet. For now, the story hung in the balance, leaving every person in the room, and every viewer, on edge. The room fell silent as Barack lowered his hand, his eyes meeting Jason's with a calm yet penetrating gaze. He didn't rush to speak, letting the tension sit like a heavy weight in the air. The crowd was on edge, some watching Jason, others focused intently on Barack, waiting to see how he would respond. It wasn't every day that someone challenged a man like him so openly, especially in a setting like this. But Barack didn't seem fazed. Instead, there was a flicker of something in his expression, a mix of curiosity and understanding. "I hear you," Barack finally said, his voice even and steady. "And you're right to ask those questions. People here have been through struggles that I can't pretend to fully understand. But that's why I'm here, to listen, to learn, and to see what I can do now." His words were simple, but there was a weight to them, a sincerity that wasn't easy to ignore. Yet Jason, his arms still crossed, didn't look convinced. "Oh, you're here to listen?" Jason said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "That's rich. I bet you've got a whole team somewhere just waiting to spin this into some feel-good story." Obama reconnects with the people. Isn't that the headline you're aiming for? His voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a knife. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, some in agreement, others uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Barack smiled faintly, though there was no amusement in his eyes. "I didn't bring any cameras, did I?" he asked gently. "And I'm not here to make headlines. I'm here because places like this remind me of where I came from. My mother raised me on her own, working hard just to get by. I've been in rooms like this before, not as a guest, but as someone looking for answers, looking for help. So believe me, I understand more than you think." The murmurs grew quieter, but Jason's expression remained defiant. "Yeah. And what did you do with all that understanding when you had the power to actually change things?" He shot back. "Because from where I'm standing, not much has changed for people like us." A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Barack to see how he would take the harsh words. Barack took a slow breath, his face calm but thoughtful. "That's a fair question," he said, nodding slightly. "The truth is, change doesn't happen as fast as we want it to. And I made mistakes. I'll be the first to admit that. But you don't stop trying because the work is hard. You keep showing up. You keep listening. That's why I'm here now, even if it's not enough for everyone." The room felt heavy with unspoken emotions, anger, frustration, and maybe even hope. Jason's smirk faltered just slightly, but before anyone could say more, an older woman in the front row spoke up. "You've got a lot of nerve, young man," she said, her voice firm but kind. "This man has done more in his lifetime than most of us could dream of. Show some respect." Jason opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Barack raised a hand again, gently silencing the woman. "It's okay," he said. "Jason's not wrong to ask these questions. They're important. And if we don't talk about them honestly, then what are we really doing here?" The crowd murmured again, but this time the tone was different, curious, maybe even thoughtful. People seemed to lean in just a little closer, as if they knew something important was about to unfold. Barack turned back to Jason, his voice quiet but firm. "So tell me, Jason," he said, "what would you do differently?" Jason hesitated for the first time, caught off guard by the directness of the question. The room felt electric, everyone waiting to see how he would respond. And in that moment it became clear, this wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was something deeper, something that would challenge not just Jason, but everyone in the room to think about their own role in the change they wanted to see. Jason's hesitation didn't last long. He straightened up, brushing off the momentary doubt like it was nothing, and fixed Barack with a challenging stare. "What would I do differently? For starters, I wouldn't wait until I was out of office to show up in places like this." His voice carried the bite of frustration, drawing a few quiet gasps from the crowd. "I'd make sure people here didn't have to fight tooth and nail for basic things like housing, jobs, or health care. I'd actually do something instead of just talking about it." Barack didn't flinch, even as Jason's words hung heavy in the room. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his thoughtful expression unchanged. "That's a good point," he said after a beat, his voice calm. "The system doesn't work the way it should, and too many people get left behind. It's easy to feel like no one's listening, especially when you've been shouting for so long." His gaze softened, and for a moment there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes, regret, perhaps, or understanding. "But I wonder, Jason, what's your plan for making things better? Because I can promise you, shouting only gets you so far." The tension in the room was palpable, and all eyes were on Jason now. He shifted uncomfortably, caught off guard by Barack's measured response. "It's not about me," he said defensively, his voice a little quieter now. It's about people here. People like my mom, who worked 3 jobs and still couldn't keep the lights on sometimes. People who've been trying to make it, only to watch everything get harder. You don't need a plan to see how broken it all is. From the back of the room, another voice broke in, a man in his 50s with greying hair and a weathered face. "He's got a point," the man said, his voice steady but tired. "I've been running a business in this neighborhood for 20 years, and every year, it feels like we're fighting an uphill battle. Taxes go up, customers have less to spend, and the city doesn't do much to help us out." He paused, glancing at Barack. "But I don't think yelling at each other is going to fix it either." The murmur of agreement that followed was tentative but growing. People were nodding, exchanging glances, and shifting in their seats. Jason, still standing, clenched his jaw and glanced around the room, his confidence wavering. He wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by his own neighbors. Meanwhile, Barack watched the scene unfold with quiet intensity, his mind working. "You're both right," he said finally, his voice cutting through the noise like a steady hand on a stormy sea. "This isn't about one person or one decision. It's about all of us, how we show up for each other, how we listen, and how we fight for the changes that matter. It's not easy, and it won't happen overnight, but if we stop talking, we stop trying. And that's not an option." His words settled over the room like a blanket, heavy and warm. Even Jason seemed at a loss for a comeback. But before the moment could sink in too deeply, a woman near the door stood up abruptly, clutching her purse. "Talking doesn't pay the bills," she said, her voice sharp and cutting through the quiet. "You can say all the right things, but at the end of the day, people here need results, not speeches." She turned and walked out, the sound of the door closing behind her echoing in the room. The silence that followed was deafening. Barack looked at the closed door for a long moment before turning back to the crowd. "She's not wrong either," he said softly, his voice laced with something like sadness. "But walking away won't change anything. Staying, even when it's hard, that's how we move forward." The room stayed tense, the weight of the conflict pressing down on everyone. Jason crossed his arms again, but this time he didn't say anything. The lines between allies and opponents were beginning to blur, and it was clear that nothing about this night would be simple or easy. The air in the room was thick with tension, every word hanging like a storm cloud ready to break. Jason shifted uneasily, his defiance still visible in his stance, but his silence betrayed something deeper, a crack in his confidence. Barack sat calmly, his hands folded, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. He could feel the weight of their emotions, frustration, hope, anger, and exhaustion. It wasn't just Jason who felt unheard, it was the entire room, maybe even the entire community. And yet, despite the quiet murmurs and uneasy glances, Barack didn't rush to speak. He waited, letting the unease simmer, knowing the next few moments could make or break everything. "I get it," Barack said finally, his voice low but steady, cutting through the restless murmurs. "You're angry, and you have every right to be." His words seemed to ripple across the room, landing differently with everyone. Some nodded quietly, their expressions softening. Others sat rigid, their skepticism still etched on their faces. Jason, however, didn't move, his jaw clenched tight as he stared at the floor. "But let me ask you something," Barack continued, his tone sharpening just slightly. "What happens if we stop showing up? If we give in to that anger and let it turn into silence? Because the truth is, that's what the people in power are counting on. They're counting on us to fight each other, to lose hope, to stop pushing for something better." The room was still now, the weight of his words settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. Jason finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. "That's easy for you to say," he shot back, his voice quieter now but still sharp. You had the power. You had the platform. And what did you really change? You talk about showing up, but what does that even mean for people like us? Barack didn't flinch, didn't react defensively. Instead, he leaned forward, his gaze locking with Jason's. It means not giving up, even when it feels like nothing is changing. It means holding each other accountable, pushing each other to do better. And it means understanding that real change doesn't come from one person. It comes from all of us, working together, even when it's messy. Jason opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the older man with the graying hair spoke up again. Maybe he's got a point, kid, he said, his voice tired but firm. We've all been through it. We've all been angry. But sitting here tearing each other down doesn't get us anywhere. Maybe it's time we start thinking about what we can do instead of what we can't. The words seemed to shift something in the room, a ripple of uncertainty spreading through the crowd. But before anyone could process what was happening, the woman who had left earlier reappeared, her face flushed with emotion. You want to talk about showing up, she said, her voice trembling. Then prove it. Don't just sit here talking. Do something. Right now. Her challenge hung in the air, electrifying the room. Barack straightened, his expression unreadable, while Jason's eyes darted between her and the former president. Everyone was holding their breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. It felt like the room could explode at any second, the tension stretched to its breaking point. And as Barack stood, ready to respond, the crowd leaned in, their hearts pounding. Desperate to know what would happen next, Barack stood still for a moment, his tall frame commanding the room without effort. The weight of the woman's challenge hung heavy in the air, her words daring him to act rather than speak. The crowd leaned forward, the tension so thick it felt almost unbearable. Jason, for all his bravado, looked genuinely uncertain now, his eyes darting between Barack and the woman, searching for a clue about what would happen next. Barack finally took a step forward, his calm yet deliberate movement sending a ripple through the crowd. You're right, Barack said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of urgency. Talk isn't enough. Words alone won't fix the problems this community is facing. So let's do something. Right here. Right now. The quiet murmur of voices grew louder as people whispered to each other, some skeptical, others intrigued. Jason's eyes narrowed, the flicker of a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips, as if daring Barack to back up his bold claim. But before Barack could elaborate, the door to the community center burst open, and a man in a dark jacket hurried in, his face pale and eyes wide with alarm. Sorry to interrupt, he said, his voice shaking, but there's been an accident. A fire. At the old housing complex down the block. It's bad. Gasps rippled through the room as people exchanged shocked glances. The old housing complex was notorious in the neighborhood, run down, overcrowded, and filled with families who couldn't afford to live anywhere else. For years, it had been a symbol of everything broken in the system, a place where hope seemed as fragile as the crumbling walls. And now, it was on fire. Is everyone out? Someone shouted from the back of the room. The man shook his head, his voice trembling as he replied, I don't know. I came straight here because I thought someone would know what to do. The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping as people tried to process the news. Some reached for their phones, calling friends or family who might be affected. Others argued about what should happen next, their voices rising in a swirl of panic and anger. Amid the commotion, Barack turned to Jason, his expression sharper now, more urgent. You wanted action, right? Barack said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. This is your chance. This is all of our chance. Are you ready to show up? Jason froze, his confidence visibly wavering. I don't know, he stammered, the fire in his voice replaced by uncertainty. "What can we even do?" Barak's gaze didn't waver. "We can start by being there," he said firmly, "because sitting here arguing won't help those families. But showing up, that might make all the difference." Before anyone could respond, Barak was already moving toward the door, his stride purposeful. The crowd hesitated, torn between fear and the magnetic pull of his leadership. Jason stood rooted to the spot, his fists clenching and unclenching as he battled with himself. And then, without a word, he followed. The rest of the room followed suit, some reluctantly, others with a sense of urgency that overpowered their fear. As they spilled into the cold night air, the faint glow of flames lit up the horizon, and the acrid scent of smoke filled their lungs. The stakes had changed, the conflict no longer just words in a room, but a real, tangible crisis. And as they hurried toward the fire, no one could have anticipated what awaited them there. The crowd rushed down the street, their footsteps echoing against the quiet tension of the night. The glow of the fire grew brighter with every step, and the air thickened with smoke, stinging their eyes and throats. When they finally reached the old housing complex, the scene was chaotic. Flames licked at the sides of the crumbling building, and families huddled together on the street, clutching children and a few salvaged belongings. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, but it was clear the fire trucks hadn't arrived yet. Time was slipping away. Barak wasted no time, his commanding presence cutting through the panic. "We need to make sure everyone is out," he called, his voice steady and loud. He turned to the group from the community center. "Check with the families. Find out who's missing and where they were last seen. We can't wait for the fire department to handle this alone." Jason stood frozen, his eyes locked on the roaring flames. His bravado had evaporated, leaving behind raw fear. Barak noticed and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Jason, listen to me," he said, his tone urgent but calm. "You said you wanted action. This is it. People need you right now. You can do this." Jason blinked, his breath shaky, but something shifted in his expression, a flicker of determination. He nodded and turned to the crowd. "If anyone knows who's still inside, tell us now," he shouted. The authority in his voice surprised even him, and people immediately began calling out names and pointing toward the building. An older woman's trembling voice rose above the chaos. "My grandson. He's on the 3rd floor. I couldn't get to him." She sobbed into her hands, and Jason's eyes widened, his fear threatening to return. But then he looked at Barak, who gave him a single, firm nod. Without thinking, Jason bolted toward the building's entrance. "Jason, wait!" someone shouted, but it was too late. He disappeared into the thick smoke, and for a moment everyone held their breath. Barak quickly stepped into action, organizing the crowd to form a line for passing water buckets and clearing a path for the fire department when they arrived. His calm under pressure was contagious, and the chaos began to feel almost manageable. Minutes passed like hours, and just as the flames began to climb higher, Jason emerged from the building, coughing violently but carrying a small boy in his arms. The crowd erupted into cheers, the boy's grandmother crying out in relief as she rushed forward to take him. Jason dropped to his knees, gasping for air, and Barak was at his side in an instant. "You did it," Barak said, his voice low but filled with pride. Jason looked up at him, tears streaming down his soot-streaked face. "Yeah, but I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted, his voice breaking. Just as the crowd began to settle, the distant sound of collapsing would brought everyone's attention back to the building. It wasn't over yet. A firefighter ran up to Barak, his face grim. "We've got reports that someone else is still inside," he said. Barak's heart sank. "Who?" he asked, dreading the answer. The firefighter hesitated before pointing toward the grandmother. She said, "Her son went back in to help, but he hasn't come out." Jason's eyes widened in horror as he looked at the grandmother, who now clutched her grandson tightly, her face pale with fear. The crowd turned to Barak, their expressions a mix of desperation and hope. The flames roared louder, and the building groaned under the weight of the fire. Time was running out, and the stakes had just risen once more. The firefighter's words sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. The grandmother's face crumpled as she clutched her grandson tighter, her tears soaking his soot-streaked hair. Jason staggered to his feet, still coughing, his gaze darting toward the building. The flames were fiercer now, the fire consuming everything in its path. For a moment, no one moved, the weight of what was at stake freezing them in place. Barak's voice broke through the tension. "We need to trust the professionals," he said firmly, addressing the crowd. "The firefighters are here now. They'll do everything they can." He turned to the firefighter who had delivered the news, his eyes steady. "Go. Find him. We'll keep supporting from out here." The firefighter nodded and rushed toward the building with his team, their silhouettes disappearing into the smoke. The crowd watched in silence, the distant crackle of flames and the occasional crash of collapsing debris the only sounds. Jason stood next to Barak, his face pale and his hands trembling. "Do you think they'll make it?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Barak looked at him, his expression somber but resolute. "We have to believe they will," he said, "and we have to be ready to help, no matter what happens next." Minutes passed like hours, each second stretching unbearably. The crowd shifted nervously, their murmurs a mix of prayers and quiet encouragement. And then, just as the tension threatened to overwhelm, the firefighters emerged from the building, carrying a man over their shoulders. The grandmother gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as she saw her son's face, covered in soot but alive. The crowd erupted into cheers, relief washing over everyone like a wave. The man was quickly tended to by paramedics, and as the fire continued to rage, the crowd slowly began to disperse. The families who had lost their homes were directed to a nearby shelter, where they would receive food, clothing, and temporary housing. Despite the destruction, there was a sense of unity in the air, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, people could come together to help one another. Jason stood off to the side, watching the scene unfold. His shoulders slumped, exhaustion finally catching up with him. Barak approached, his steps deliberate, and placed a hand on Jason's shoulder. "You made a difference tonight," he said, his voice steady and kind. "Not just for that boy, but for everyone who saw you step up when it mattered most." Jason looked at Barak, his eyes red-rimmed but filled with something new, pride. "I guess. Maybe I was wrong about you," he said hesitantly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "And maybe I've been wrong about myself too." Barak smiled back, a small but genuine gesture. "The important thing is, you showed up," he said. "That's where change begins." As the fire trucks pulled away and the smoke began to clear, the community center stood as a symbol of resilience. The night had been filled with chaos, but it ended with hope, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming challenges, unity and action could make a difference. Jason glanced back at Barak one last time, his expression thoughtful. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. For the first time in a long time, he believed that change wasn't just a dream, it was something within reach. And as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, the neighborhood felt just a little brighter, a little stronger, and a little closer to the future they all deserved.